Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's workshop, Asian Americans and the Movement for Black Lives, Asian Anti-Black Racism, Solidarities, and the Political Promise of Popular Culture. This event is a part of a year-long series of events entitled Anti-Blackness and Alliance, a series on Asian Black race relations, co-hosted by the Asian American Center and Carolina Asia Center, and co-sponsored by the Sonia Haynes Stone Center for Black Culture and History, the Center for the Study of American South, the Office of the Vice Provost for the Academic and Community Engagement, and the Office of the Senior Associate Dean for the Social Sciences and Global Programs in the College of Arts and Sciences. Last fall, we opened this series with a film screening and discussion of the documentary, I'm Not Racist, Am I? And we also hosted Professor Aiko Day's talk that examined the issues of affirmative action related to Asian American college admissions. And we explored how the figure of the Asian American student has been recruited to expand the property interest and entitlement of whiteness since the 1970s. The recordings of the past events are available on Facebook pages of either AAC or CAC. Tonight's event is the third event in the series, and we are also in the process of arranging a potential panel in late April with activists. So please stay tuned for further information in the coming weeks. With this series, we intend to bring a wide variety of speakers, academics, activists, and film directors to discuss the multifaceted interracial connections and discourses between Asian American and Black communities. We hope this series can also help us to create a space for solidarity to counter racial injustice and discrimination and violence, and improve racial relations in our country. I'll now turn the floor over to Professor Heidi Kim, the director of the Asian American Center, to introduce our workshop facilitator, Dr. Nitasha Sharma. Thank you. Heidi?
Thanks, Jian. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this very timely workshop. We really appreciate your attendance, and we hope that you'll engage as Dr. Sharma poses lots of questions for all of us to think about together. A couple of housekeeping notes. It might be easier for you, since we have a large number of attendees, to make sure you're in speaker view. You can do that by clicking on the little icon that says View in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom. And if we have lots of discussion going, it may be helpful to use your raise hand function, which you can do by clicking on the appropriate icon. And feel free to message me if you have any questions about technical issues during the Zoom. It's a great pleasure for me to get to introduce our guest speaker tonight, because I knew her all the way back when I was a grad student, just getting into Asian American studies. And she's really been a kind of leading voice in looking at Asian Black interconnections for most of her career. So we couldn't think of a better person for this series, and we were delighted when she offered to do this type of an interactive workshop for our community. Dr. Nitasha Sharma is a comparative race studies scholar and a professor of African American Studies, and also in the program in Asian American Studies at Northwestern University. She offers an interdisciplinary, comparative, and ethnographic approach to the study of difference, inequality, and racism. The central goal of her teaching, research, and writing is to contest interminority racisms by using ethnography to detail existing models of cross-racial solidarities among non-white groups. And by highlighting these historical crossovers and expansive political orientations, Dr. Sharma's work attempts to imagine liberated futures for all people. Her forthcoming book, Hawaii is My Haven, Race and Indigeneity in the Black Pacific, is an ethnography based on a decade of field work, including interviews with 60 people of African descent in the islands, including people who are of mixed race. And her questions in this project are, what does the Pacific offer people of African descent? And how does the racial lens of African Americans illuminate inequalities, including anti-Black racism in the islands, which is where she is from. And so she continually brings Black studies into conversation with Native studies. I also want to mention that she is one of this year's inaugural Asian American Center Fellows, academics and artists who are coming virtually this year to our university to engage in depth with our students, staff, faculty, and community members. So again, it gives me such great pleasure to have you here, Nitasha.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Heidi looks exactly as she did. I don't know how long it was, maybe 10 years ago when she was a grad student at Northwestern. Heidi, thank you so much for inviting me. And also thank you to Jian as well. Both of you have been such wonderful communicators, and to the Asian American Studies, to the Asian American Center at UNC. As you know, these Zoom workshops are really bizarre because I'm just looking at a bunch of blank boxes, but I try my hardest, and hopefully we'll all be back in person at some point in the future. We actually arranged this workshop months ago, the exact topic, but several months ago, the idea of hosting something like this, which should tell you something about, you know, the relevance, at least to me and my outlook on things, on having these conversations without a necessary mass murder of Asian people to inspire it. So that's something that I want us to think about, right? Is that while this conversation about Asian anti-Black racism, Asian-Black relations, the tensions and the possibilities, and questions of solidarity and decarceration, or sort of ending the criminal and justice system, might be new to some of you. In a lot of ways, this is a long-term conversation. Okay, so this is a workshop, but there's a lot of people here. There's about 56 of you. And so I'm just gonna speak to the blank boxes and you can respond. Sometimes I'll ask questions. And I want to do this in a way that's really helpful for you. So I think we'll be on for about another hour 15 minutes, and hopefully we'll have a productive conversation. And I'll just say that I'm gearing this to undergraduates at your institution. So that's sort of where the conversation is coming from. So one thing I want us to think about is the responsibility and accountability of Asian Americans for thinking about and being participants in racial discourse in the United States. And any conversation that I have, including what we'll talk about today, really has to do with what is our position in the economic, political, and cultural spheres of this nation, and how is that informed by a global approach. So I don't really want to just talk about Asian and Black relations as if they start with and end with US boundaries and history, right? So how are our relationships sort of expand well beyond the nation and well beyond this current moment? And the way that we learn about that is by taking ethnic studies classes and reading about African-American history and reading about Asian American processes and politics, right? So I think that that's really key, and that's what the center is really hosting. So today I just want to say that we will have time for you to ask questions in the chat. That would be really helpful for me to know what you are interested in talking about. And what how I describe this workshop is that it's going to consider popular culture as a politically fertile ground for creating and sustaining cross-racial Asian and Black solidarities. But I want us to move beyond, particularly for Asian Americans, I want us to move beyond the motivating kind of question of guilt and self-flagellation that I feel that a lot of Asian Americans who are becoming politically aware and especially racially aware, those two things are not always the same, that we kind of enter the conversation on race in the United States from a position of guilt and a position of not knowing if we have a space. And I kind of want to do away with that. I'd love to just step right over that and have a conversation. So I want us to move beyond questions of guilt, also beyond the framing of the model minority, which also goes hand in hand with this question. And I want us to consider something that Angela Davis has said. Thank you so much, Alyssa. I can see somebody, and Marie. I want us to think about what Angela Davis has said, which is about not having our identities frame our politics, but having our politics frame our identities. And I want us to think about that, right? That our politics come, right? That our identities come from our politics. And tied to this, if any of you have heard me speak before, you know I'm going to say these things, and I say them for decades. And it really is that I want us to think expansively about who our people are, right? So when things happen in the world or in the US, I feel connection to a lot of people that are not necessarily who my ancestry is or what my gender or my sexuality is. So how can we think expansively about who our people is? Because a lot of times we're only motivated to take part in understanding and knowledge development and consciousness raising, and particularly only move to act when we think, oh shit, this is something that is going to affect our people. So then we need to make sure to vote and vote in this way. So my question is, we are never going to have mass large scale solidarities to end inequality and lead to liberated futures for all people if we are only kind of basing our ideas about what we should act on based on what's good for our people, if we think narrowly about who our people are, right? If we think and we only adopt sort of those categories that have been given to us. Okay, so that whatever the dinging is, I don't think it's coming from my side, so I'm just letting you folks know. Thank you, Patrick, for the hands up. Okay, so for the thumbs up. Okay, so that's what is really motivating me. And as Heidi said in the opening, I've been looking at Asian-Black relations for a very long time. And my first book came from my dissertation, and it was on South Asian American popular culture. And it's really framed, it came out in 2010, but it was really framed first by a kind of grounding, kind of context chapter that really talked about South Asian anti-Black racism and the reasons for that and the problems with that. And I really took, quote unquote, my community to task for that. But the rest of the book is kind of like where I want us all to be, right? Is like, okay, given that that is the context and we have to acknowledge that, we can't be stuck there. And I do feel like our conversations have sort of snowballed toward that, but now we're stuck with how do we talk to our racist parents about their anti-Black feelings. And I think that's very critical work, but we got to do more, and we have to get past that. And we can't all get past that, but some of us should then move on to look at what are the models of solidarity that we see, right? What are the models that show that we can collaborate and that difference is not something to be overcome? So I want us to think about that. A few framing things I want to say, and then I'll get into some questions that maybe some of you want to explore with me. And then this workshop will generally be me kind of talking like this, but I would also like to hear what you want to say when I raise some questions, and then we can also take it to where you want to go, because I don't know where you all are politically and et cetera. I'm sorry about the dinging. So one thing I want to say is this, and I think that this does distinguish me a bit from a lot of the work that I've been hearing about Asian-Black solidarities recently and Asian-Black tensions. To me, Asian-Black relations have to do with tensions, solidarities, possibilities, right? And one thing that makes, I think, my perspective a little different is that there are no innocent subjects, okay? Nobody is innocent here. Everybody is accountable. And that's why I don't only shame or berate or chastise Asian Americans for our lack of political engagement with issues of race and racism, right? I think that it's really critical that we understand that everybody is accountable. And tied to that, I want us to think about the fact that let's not get stuck up on the identities that we are given, right? So that's like the idea of race, right? I can choose to identify as a woman of color, but when I walk around in the United States after 9/11, right, people might see me as a Muslim looking person, right? Or as South Asian, or maybe as Mexican. So that's the question of race. But I don't want us to get stuck on this is the deck of cards that I was dealt. Those positionalities are so critical and key. What our gender is, our class status, our racial identities, especially for multiracials. I want us to think about people who are Black and Asian, right? That these are not just two separate incommensurable groups. But I want us to rather think about how it is that our identities don't delimit the world of what our politics should be. And by that, I mean that we are not simply bad people because we have a certain identity, and we're not simply automatically progressive or victims because we have another identity that we were born with. It is rather the way that you and I choose to educate ourselves about how power works and then how we move through institutions. So whatever our conglomeration of identities are and our access to privilege and lack of privilege, whatever it is, circumscribes our ability to navigate institutions and what institutions are there for us. But rather than just saying that if one is Asian, then one is anti-Black, right? I want us to rather think about, as an Asian American, for instance, what is our relationship to systems of power that oppress people? So are we taking part in police abolition? Where are we spending our money, at Starbucks or at the local mom and pop coffee shop? Right? Are we sending our children to public schools in highly diverse areas, or are we moving to the suburbs and raising Asian children in white neighborhoods? So what is our relationship, right, to particular systems of power? And then how does that cumulatively, meaning all of us, and then also over time, come to economically and politically impact people in differential ways? Everybody kind of got that? So nobody is innocent. And what I'm saying here is that people might ask later on today, right? How do we understand the Black perpetrators of anti-Asian violence that we've seen, right? And we will talk about it. And I think people have wanted to sidestep that question. And the question is that is very disproportionate, first of all, right? That the news, just like the 1992 Korean uprisings, really focused on a Black Korean conflict when it was structured by economic global processes that located Koreans and Black folks in South Central at very different positions. And so it was really framed by white supremacy and the demands of labor, but the media frames it as a Black Asian tension. That's also happening today, right? Where we're thinking about, Black anti-Asian violence, right? But this goes, and that's disproportionate because if you look at who is committing violence against Asian Americans, it is not predominantly people of African descent. That said, I don't think that Black people as a whole as well are not accountable for particular things. That is, and I can give an example of that down the way when we talk, for instance, about US imperialism and the military complex across the Pacific and Asia, right? Just one example is that Barack Obama, a mixed race Black president from Hawaii, where I am, he was the commander in chief. And during the longest global war on terror, right? Responsible for the murdering of many, many people in the Middle East. Similarly, there was a recent celebration of the new defense secretary. So this person is a person who is going to lead the military. And this is a Black man for the first time. And that's hailed as a mode of arrival, of incorporation, of a celebration. But what does it mean if a Black man is now Secretary of Defense, which is responsible for the imperialism across the Pacific and Asia, as well as bombing in the Middle East? So again, I want us to think about the kind of nexus between our individual identities, right? Those that we choose and those that are placed upon us, our understanding of how institutions and power operates, and then the choices that we make, right? Which some people have lots of choices, some people have very circumscribed choices, upholding or decimating, right? Or eradicating these systems of power. So that's what I want to say. There are no innocent subjects, and it's about how we move to uphold or decimate, right? To get rid of these systems of oppression that differentially affect people such as Asian Americans and African Americans. We're not affected in the same ways, but to me, the system is the same. The second thing is I want us to consider that it is absolutely a duty, a responsibility of Asian Americans to take part in educating ourselves about racial justice and how race operates in the United States. And I don't just mean this about Asian American youth who are born here, who understand and who are racialized as East Asians or as South Asians or as Muslim looking. I want us to understand, especially from the Black Korean uprising in 1992, that even for Asian Americans who are struggling and working class, we cannot remain disengaged from racial politics in the United States and only show out when it affects us, because it should always affect us, because it's affecting people who we live with, people who are in our neighborhoods, people who are in this nation, people who are around the globe. So if there is a crisis at the US-Mexico border, that should affect us, right? If there is a disproportionate incarceration and profiling of Black men and women, that should affect us, is what I'm kind of trying to say. But I don't think we're all there yet. We have to be convinced, like, who cares unless it affects us? Well, now we see that anti-Asian racism and white supremacy and the global demand for particular kinds of labor that is based on race, gender, and sex, it does affect us, right? And we would have a lot more allies if we also had shown out for other folks as well. And I know a lot of youth are doing that, right? Okay, so racial justice and the responsibility of being a global citizen means that as Asian Americans, we have to learn not just about our cultural stories or our histories of Korean Americans or Vietnamese Americans or Filipino Americans. We have to understand our relationalities to the development of this nation vis-a-vis other communities of color. And that's really critical. And that includes being a settler on Indigenous land, right? I think that's really important. So racial justice is an Asian American issue, and how are we going to take part in this, right? And I don't want you to get overwhelmed. I know I'm speaking a lot. I'll pause in a second to ask you folks what you want to talk about. I don't want us to get overwhelmed with, you know, the system is so fucked up. How are we ever going to change anything? That's where I'm saying it's not like, oh, well, this is the identity I'm given. I can't do anything about it. Let me just live my life and accumulate capital, right? Like a lot of our parents wanted to be upwardly mobile, send our kids to good schools, and kind of not engage in racial politics. And I'm saying that we can't afford to do that. It's immoral to do that, okay? The second thing, or the third thing, right? There are no innocent subjects, right? Racial justice and an analysis of race is important for Asian Americans to undertake, not just for us, but to understand how race writ large affects different groups in different ways and how we participate in that. The next thing I want us to think about, and again, this is for undergrads, right? Some of you might be rolling your eyes because you've heard all of this from your amazing professors, is that when we talk about race in the United States and racial issues, this should not just signal Black or Black and white, right? We really need to, understand how all groups are racialized, including white folks. White is a race. The unmarked norm is a race. And I notice that every time I step into a class that's not an ethnic studies class, I realize, oh yeah, Northwestern, where I teach, is a white place, right? That's a race. I see that, right? So I want us to think about race beyond the ways that we're taught, okay? And that's really critical. And finally, two more things. One is that inaction is a form of complicity. So all of the inequalities that at least I'm concerned about, and I know many of you are concerned about, right? People's closeness to death, which particularly speaks to people of African descent, whose closeness to death, as Ruth Gilmore talks about, is what defines racism, right? Asians have a different relationship to death, right? And I want us to think about how our inaction, right, is a form of complicity. It's a form of maintaining these systems that lead to, right, an inequality that fatally affects some people, right? And that literally benefits the life expectancy and the economic income of other people. And the last thing I'll say before opening up to try to have a conversation with you all is kind of what I started with. I don't want us to come from a place of guilt. I think coming from a place of unknowing is good because we should all be students, but guilt is not always generative. And I say that as a Jewish person who has a lot of Jewish guilt, okay? My dad is Indian and my mom is white. So guilt is not always a generative position. Okay. So how are you all doing right now? You okay? Okay. Just bear with me and please be gentle because we just don't know how the damn Zoom thing works. I mean, I see you, but I can't interact with you. Thank you all for the thumbs up. So I have some framing questions that I wanted to ask about, and this can walk us through our workshop, okay? So I want to understand what you folks understand to be the racial position of Asians in the US. And to just clarify, Asian American Studies was really started through the Third World Liberation Front as a political project, and it became more of a cultural project which was co-opted by the multicultural 90s, so that we ended up offering identity-based classes. And now I would say, very thankfully, the field of Asian American studies is really coming to reckon with race and capitalism, right? And Asian, Black, people of color relationality. So what is your understanding of the racial position of Asian folks in the US?